Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist Third Worldist Collective. In this podcast, I wanted to address the subject of religion as the opiate or opium of the masses. What did Karl Marx mean? Can't get inside Karl Marx's head, so I don't really know what he means or meant. But I can talk about how I think that Marx's statement should be interpreted. And I think it has been grossly misinterpreted over the course of many years to mean that Marx was advocating something like atheism. Now, in terms of Marx's own beliefs, I don't know. Maybe he was an atheist. Maybe he was an agnostic, as referred to by Darwin's bull, Thomas Henry Huxley. Maybe he was, to use the modern term, an apatheist, basically meaning somebody who doesn't care, basically kind of a combination of apathy and theist. Clever term. I don't know what he was. He certainly was not a devoutly religious man. Neither was Engels. Uh, they were both very secular people, and Marxism is a secular theory and a secular philosophy and a secular sociology. Um, but I think we can exclude some things from what Marx was talking about. I do think this is especially important in talking about the third world. Why? Well, because generally speaking, people in the third world are more religious than people in the first world. People in the first world tend to be rather secular. The Enlightenment, for example, was basically a movement that affected the first world primarily. It was a Western movement that started in Europe and then gradually made its way to North America, especially the United States and Canada. Um, that Enlightenment really did not have a major impact on most of Latin America, with some exceptions. And so we really should not assume um, that Marx was talking about anything that was related specifically to religion in a universal sense. Why? Well, Marx and Engels were not religious scholars. My primary specialization in sociology is the sociology of religion, sometimes more broadly considered as a part of religious studies, and secondarily, religious theory. So I have long been interested in this subject. Why? Because I am a religious guy. And why would I want to accept a theory made up by a man who was anti-religious? There is no indication, for example, that Marx would have agreed with the views, say, of the late Christopher Hitchens and his new atheism, or of Kyle Kulinski, who was also, I think, or at least was, a subscriber to the new atheism. He runs the YouTube channel Secular Talk. If you go back and watch Kyle's early podcasts, they were, I'm not going to say exclusively, but almost exclusively devoted to the subject of the new atheism, which, as a religious guy, honestly turned me off. I liked Kyle. Kyle is a brilliant guy. He's now 35 years old. I've been watching him since he was in his early 20s. He has matured over the years and his following has increased. Kyle is not a communist. So I don't agree with him on many issues, but I like him. I think he's a decent human being, and I occasionally will watch his podcasts, and I often will gain something from watching them. But I don't think Marx would have agreed with the New Atheism. The New Atheism is basically a kind of anti-religion problem. There is no such thing as religion. Let me say that again, in case you didn't hear it the first time. There is no such thing as religion. Religion does not exist. I once had a student when I was going through a bunch of oppressive things in the world, and he said, "What about religion?" And so my response was, "Which religion? There is no such thing as religion." He got really, really upset. I don't know why, but he did not like that response. It seems like he was very attached to the idea that religion was a real thing, and not simply a category. And the fact that I said that there was no such thing as religion, there are only religions, seemed to really bother him. So I assume, although I don't know for sure, that he was at least somewhat influenced by this notion of the New Atheism, which is anti-religion. It is impossible, theoretically impossible, to be anti-religion because no such thing exists. For example, give you an example. The ethical culture movement that was started by Felix Adler in the 19th century. Now, Felix Adler was born the son of a Reform Jewish rabbi, a liberal Jewish rabbi. In the US, it's called Reform. In most of the world, it's called liberal. But Felix Adler did not want to become a rabbi, although he was interested in religion. I assume it was because of his father's rabbinical avocation. So he started his own religion, and it actually is a religion. It was incorporated from the very beginning as a religion, and he called it ethical culture. It is sometimes also referred to as ethical humanism, the Ethical Humanist Society, and by various other names. It was founded originally in Brooklyn, New York. It is a relatively small religion. There, once you leave the Northeast, you're not going to find that many chapters or branches of ethical culture. It's mostly in the Northeast, in the New York City area primarily, Boston, whatever, maybe Los Angeles. I know there was one ethical culture movement group in St. Louis, Missouri, because I once contacted them. I wanted to see if they were planning on starting a chapter in Kansas City, not because I wanted to join it, but because I wanted to, as a sociologist of religion, attend their meetings. That's what I do. I attend meetings of different religions. And I have in the past gone to some ethical culture meetings, but it was a long time ago. They have ministers. Their ministers are called leaders, but they are regular clergy. They can perform weddings. They can officiate at funerals. They can do all the things that ministers, priests, and rabbis do. They're just not called priests, ministers, and rabbis. They're called leaders. But other than that, they're the same. There is a lot of interchange between ethical culture and the Unitarian Universalist Association. There are some people who are both ethical culture leaders and Unitarian Universalist Association, or UUA, ministers. Some people serve in both capacities. Now, are they identical? Not really. They're close. I would say that ethical culture is more exclusively humanistic. The UUA is humanistic, but it's also open to a variety of other ideas, including liberal Christianity, Wicca, and various other forms of religious practice. So ethical culture is relatively unique. Not exclusively unique, but relatively unique. When you go to their meetings, there are lectures about ethics, and that's what they do. They have a natural law approach to ethics. Namely, they believe that we learn ethics from nature, that ethics are embedded in nature. And simply by being natural beings, which as human beings they say we are, they don't believe generally in the existence of an immortal soul. There are exceptions. They're not opposed to that. There may be some ethical culture people who do believe in an immortal soul, but that is not common. Generally speaking, they are secular. Most commonly today, they are atheistic. Now, was Felix Adler himself an atheist? No, he was not really an atheist. Perhaps he could be called an agnostic in a sense, but he was not an atheist strictly in the modern sense of the term. He did not entirely dismiss the possibility of a deity. Many ethical culture people today, or ethical humanists, do dismiss the possibility of a deity, which would, by definition, make them what is called strong atheists. That is, a strong atheist, someone who actually completely and unreservedly dismisses the possibility of a deity. Now, if a person is a new atheist, would that person object to ethical culture? I can't imagine that. Ethical culture appears to me to align almost perfectly with the ideas of new atheism. I don't know why a new atheist would be opposed to it. It seems perfectly harmonious, perfectly harmonious. Even the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, would be to an extent harmonious with the new atheism, or at least parts of the UUA would be. And there are a lot of Unitarian Universalists, or as they call themselves, UUs, who are atheists, and some who may be new atheists. So the idea that religion is a thing can simply be dismissed without any question. Religion is a category. It is not a thing. As a sociologist, I like Emil Durkheim's definition of religion. It is the most common definition used by people in my field. A system of beliefs and praxes. Praxes are theoretically based practices focused on the sacred, which unite people into a moral community. Let's break that down a bit. What is the sacred? To Durkheim, the sacred is the opposite of the profane. The profane does not mean profanity in the sense of vulgarity, like four-letter words. That's not what profane meant to Durkheim. He was using profane in its more classical sense. He meant ordinary things. For most people in the Western world, that would be brushing your teeth, taking a shower, having breakfast, driving to work. Now, that is not necessarily universal. In some religions, those things would be sacred too. But for most Westerners, no. For most Westerners, those would be profane activities. People do those without necessarily thinking that they are engaging in some kind of religious worship. Okay? So, the sacred is the opposite of that. The sacred are things which are not profane. The sacred refers to extraordinary things, just as the profane refers to ordinary things. So it's a system of beliefs and praxes, theoretically based practices, focused on the sacred, the extraordinary, which unite people into a moral community. Durkheim spent considerable time delving into what he meant by morality. By morality, he was talking about a system of values which are shared by people in a society. He wrote a book called Moral Education. Really good book. It's not one of Durkheim's more commonly read books, but I would recommend that you read it if you have not. It is public domain. You can download it from archive.org or just put in moral education in quotes, followed by PDF, and it should come right up. And you'll be able to download it and read it. To Durkheim, morality is something which is shared by members of a society. And if a person wants to be considered as being an effectively functioning member of that society, that person needs to commit herself or himself to that moral system, to that system of whatever norms and values that society adheres to. Okay, so now we have the basic definition of religion from Emil Durkheim. And again, that is the definition which is most commonly used by sociologists of religion, and for good reason. It is a very encompassing definition. It includes a lot. If I say, for instance, that religion refers to the supernatural, that's problematic. Now, I mean, I can do that, but effectively, I have left out a lot of systems which call themselves religions, like ethical culture, which does not believe in a supernatural. I've also left out Confucianism, which is not based on the supernatural. So there's a problem with specified definitions of religion, which exclude certain things and include others. Durkheim's definition is inclusive, but it's also specific. And that's what makes it, I think, particularly useful. Okay. So let's begin with Durkheim's definition, and let's take that definition. Whether you like it or not, for the time being, simply bracket all other definitions you might have, meaning put them all off to the side and focus on Durkheim's definition of religion, a system of beliefs and praxes focused on the sacred, which unite people into a moral community. That would include ethical culture. Beliefs and praxes. Well, they believe in the importance of nature, the importance of kindness to nature, in ecology. They believe in terms of praxes, They believe in engaging in a positive relationship with nature, and in being kind to each other. And again, they believe that those moral codes come directly from the material world, or, in other words, from nature itself. Beliefs and praxis. Focused on the sacred. Well, to an ethical culturist, the sacred would be life itself. Life itself is seen as being sacred, which unite people into a moral community, meaning a community of people who share a common code of morality. It's a very simple definition, and it's immensely useful because of both its broadness, but also its specificity. That's why we in sociology like it so much generally. Are there exceptions? There are always exceptions, but generally, we in the sociology of religion like Durkheim's definition, even if we are not Durkheimians. I am not a Durkheimian, but I like Durkheim's definition of religion. That same definition can be more readily applied to supernatural religions. For example, a system of beliefs and praxis. Say we're talking about, I don't know, let's say Pentecostalism. Belief would be in God. Praxis would include things like speaking in tongues, prophesying, miraculous gifts of healing, the interpretation of tongues, and so on, attending church services. Focused on the sacred. The sacred would be the Bible, above all. Above all, maybe also prophecy, but certainly the Bible would be the foremost source of the sacred to a Pentecostal, which unite people into a moral community. Well, the moral community would be the church, right? It is from the church, or the denomination considered more broadly, that members of a particular Pentecostal denomination, and there are many of them, get their sense of what is moral, right? A moral community, which forms the basis for their moral community. So, what I hope I have just done is to debunk the idea that Karl Marx was refuting all religion. Now, if that was not good enough for you, I will continue. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were not religious scholars. That's pretty evident. That's not their specialization. They never studied religions. That was not their field. I doubt that they knew anything about Confucianism or Buddhism or Zoroastrianism or Sikhism, etc. Ethical culture hadn't even been started yet, so they couldn't have known about that. The same thing is true with universalism, Unitarian Universalism, which I believe was started in 1963 through the merger of the Unitarian and Universalist churches. So those denominations didn't even exist. There was no way to talk about them since they hadn't even come into existence. Now, would Karl Marx have objected, let's say, to ethical culture? Of course not. He might have joined it. He might have joined it. He might have even joined the UUA. I could very easily see Karl Marx as a leader in ethical culture, an ordained leader. Maybe he would have become one. I don't know. Maybe not. Ethical culture is an American movement, but there are similar movements in the UK, and he and Engels, I should say, spent the second half of their lives living in England. So they might have joined some British equivalent of ethical culture in England. I don't know. That's a possibility. So, okay. My point is that in saying religion is the opium of the masses, they were not talking about all religions, obviously, because they didn't know about all religions. How could they? I mean, I am a religious scholar, and even I shouldn't say even I, that sounds pretentious, but I don't know about all religions. I don't. Maybe I've heard of them. Do I know about them? Not really. I mean, there are a lot of religions I know a little bit about, like Jainism, but I've never explored them in depth. I have some basic understanding of Jainism, but it's admittedly superficial. I certainly would not call myself an expert on Jainism. There are so many different sects of Buddhism, it's hard to be an expert on Buddhism. So, in other words, certainly Marx and Engels would not have known about all these different religions and sects and denominations of these religions. So when they talked about religion, what were they talking about? Well, that is not hard to answer. They were born and raised in Germany. What was the dominant religious denomination in Germany? The Lutheran Church. Undoubtedly, they had some knowledge of the Lutheran Church. Undoubtedly. Now, Marx himself came from a Jewish background. Sadly, he was also anti Semitic, which is unfortunate. I don't know how much he knew about Judaism. My guess is not much. If he did, he probably would not be anti Semitic. But regardless, he certainly knew about Lutheranism. How could he? He was a German. When he and Engels migrated to England, you have the Anglican Communion, which in the US is called the Episcopal Church. Same religion. Both are under the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Anglican Communion is simply called by different names in different countries, but it's the same exact denomination. The Anglican Communion, like Roman Catholicism, calls its religious leaders priests. Unlike Roman Catholicism, those priests can get married. So, okay. So we've, I think, figured out two religions that Marx and Engels most likely had at least some familiarity with: Lutheranism and Anglicanism. Okay, now, so when they said religion is the opium of the people, or the opium of the masses, depending upon the translation, what were they saying? Again, that is an easy question to answer. What is opium? Opium is a painkiller. It kills both physical pain and emotional pain. It makes you feel better if you're suffering, physically or emotionally. You feel better taking opium. That's what it does. Opium used to be legal in much of the world. It's not legal in the West anymore, and most Western countries have made it into a controlled substance, and it's not legal, but it used to be. And a lot of people, especially wealthy aristocrats, would use it because it was fairly expensive. People would smoke it in opium pipes. And so what I think Marx and Engels were saying is that just as opium kills emotional and physical pain, so religion, and again, what religions? Anglicanism and Lutheranism, right? Kills spiritual pain. Kills spiritual pain. It makes one feel as though one is okay. Remember, Marx and Engels were revolutionaries. They wanted to bring about a communist revolution, and they believed incorrectly that there would be revolutions in much of Europe at the end of the 19th century. But regardless, they were revolutionaries. They wanted a revolution or revolutions all over the world. That was their objective. And to them, the religions they knew about were obstacles. Here's an example, and it's an example which comes directly from Marx. In the US, you had slave plantations. In many cases, not all, but in many cases, the owners of the plantations, the masters, mistresses, that sounds so awful, but would encourage their slaves to attend black churches, not their churches, but black churches. Why? Well, Marx speculated that it was to encourage the slaves to think, well, I may be suffering in this world. I may be a slave. I may be treated really, really badly. I may be working in the cotton fields all day, not receiving a salary. But Jesus also suffered the passion of Christ. So I can look to Jesus. I can look to many of the early Christian martyrs, and I can be like them. I can be Christ-like. And so, to Marx and Engels, religion, as they defined it, which was in a very narrow sense, was a way for people to avoid becoming revolutionaries, right? It was a way for them to become complacent, not to worry about their existing condition, not to struggle to free themselves from the chains of capitalism, but to content themselves with bondage, with slavery, with working who knows how many hours per day in cotton fields. So I think that if we look at it that way, if we look at religion in a very narrow and specific sense, and remember that Marx and Engels were not religious scholars, we can have a better appreciation for what they were saying in terms of Religion. Religion is the opium of the people. Well, that's what slavery did. It was a painkiller. Religion became a painkiller. So they could more readily, according to Marx, tolerate the inhumanities of slavery without staging a revolt or without staging an uprising. Well, of course, uprisings occurred anyway, fortunately, and eventually slavery was eliminated, although one could argue that even today, we are still living with the vestiges of slavery. I think the Black Lives Matter movement is evidence of that. The way that cops treat African Americans much, much more horribly than they treat European Americans. So slavery itself has gone away, but the relics of slavery are still with us, sadly. Hopefully that will not always be the case. But in any event, I think that what I have said is especially important for the third world. Why? Because generally, not always, but generally the third world is a lot more religious than the first world. Let's take Roman Catholicism, for example. Most Roman Catholics in the United States are not that religious. They may go to church once in a while. They may go to confession once in a while, but that's about it. I remember I once had a conversation with this guy. He asked me what my religious background was, and I told him, well, my parents were Jewish, but they were non-practicing Jews. They didn't practice the religion, and neither do I. And I said, what is your religion? And he said, well, I don't know. Maybe Catholic, maybe Jewish. I'm not sure. Now, he may be an extreme example, okay? I doubt there are that many people like him, but he is an illustration of the fact that Americans generally are not that religious. We are a secular society. We are a secular society for the most part. You go down to Latin America, and arguably, where I am living in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas is a part of Latin America. Most people who live here are Mexican Americans, and I live 2 miles from Mexico. So I would say that I live in Latin America. I think Latin America certainly includes a part of the United States. Some would argue, and I wouldn't object to it necessarily, that Latin America includes the entire United States, that the United States is both Anglo-American and Latin American. Be that as it may. In Latin America, where Roman Catholicism is the most widely practiced religion, Roman Catholicism is very, very serious. People take that religion very seriously. People here, where I live, take that religion very seriously, I think. Sometimes I wonder about that based on the corruption that exists in this area, but be that as it may, I don't know. But there are a lot of Roman Catholic churches here. A lot. A lot. And there aren't that many churches of other denominations. There's one Jewish temple, and it is a Reformed temple in this area, which means it's a liberal Jewish temple. That's it. So this is a Roman Catholic area. There is a beautiful park if you ever come down here to Mission, it's a wonderful park. There's an old church on the park, an old Roman Catholic church. Was built in the 19th century, but it's small and beautiful. I would suggest you go there. Just sit there and lay back and relax. That's what I do. I go in there. I'm not Roman Catholic, but I sit down, lay back and relax. Sometimes for like 45 minutes to an hour. It is wonderful. Religiously, this is a really nice area to live. Religiously, I have always liked Roman Catholicism for what that's worth. But in any event, Latin America is a very religious place. And Latin America is the third world, part of it. And so I think especially in the third world, which generally is more religious than the first world, having a proper appreciation for religion, having a proper understanding of Marx's statement, religion is the opium of the people, is vitally important. Because if we misrepresent that, we can very easily turn people off. And right now, I am engaging in conscientization. I hope that Roman Catholics will at some point watch this podcast. I hope. And will get a better understanding of what Marx said. Because if we really want people to become Maoist third worldists, or even Marxists of any sort, whatever, but I hope Maoist third worldists, then we need to be sensitive to the religious consciences of people living in the third world. For now, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist Third Worldist Collective. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.